My name is Eman Safadi, co-founder of FOREIGNERZ, and I'm also the community outreach manager here at BUMP. So this panel is very important to me personally. Not only do I reach out to create strategic partnerships for BUMP, and I'm also a Palestinian woman. So I think that these two things, being out in the community, interacting with artists, part of FOREIGNERZ, where we do respond to a lot of urgent art, revolution, liberation, and social change through public art is something that I think we're gonna have a very in-depth conversation. I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. So here is Dr. Trevor Stark, who is the Associate Professor of Art History in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Calgary. Harvey Nichol, who is a multidisciplinary and innovative artist based in Calgary. He studied at Alberta University for the Arts and has collaborated with major brands and organizations, including the City of Calgary, Neo Financial, Brookfield Properties, and Herschel Supply. As well as Dan Cardinal, interdisciplinary artist and curator. Dan is the co-artistic director at Stride Gallery here in Calgary and is a core member of the OCC1 Contemporary Art Gallery and Contemporary Art Center in Edmonton. So please give a round of applause for our amazing panelists. Yes, so let's start off hot. So my first question is, can public art be used as a tool for social and political revolution in today's society?
Okay, well, since I'm the art historian, maybe I should start and then the other two panelists can bring us up to the contemporary moment, possibly, I hope. So I teach the history of primarily 20th century art, 19th century as well. And I guess what first comes to my mind when I hear the question is that in the history of art, basically in recorded history in Europe and then the colonial world, the history of public art has been the history of monuments. And what is a monument? A monument is defined by its ability to persist in time, right, through history, and it's defined by its physical endurance, like it's made of hard material, bronze, stone, it's made to last. Therefore, monuments are always kind of a claim on importance, a claim on what a culture sees, or what that culture's power structure sees as worth preserving. And so therefore, of course, the history of public art has been primarily a history of self-celebration by the powerful of the powerful. And so I think that when you're thinking of the history of radical, revolutionary public art, you're also thinking about a history of the destruction of monuments as well. That's something I kind of want to put on the table right from the beginning, that public art is always a battlefield of different perspectives, a battlefield for who has the right to be represented, how that representation is carried out, and who has claim over public space, which narratives are seen as worthy of persisting in history and which are erased. So therefore, a harmonious, happy history of public art, I think would be a false one. Public art is a history of conflict, right? So if I was doing a kind of a history of a revolution in public art, I might start with two examples, sort of off the top of my head. It would be 1871, the painter Gustave Courbet, who is one of the most famous painters of his day in France, is embroiled in the Paris Commune in May 1871, where the city of Paris is taken over by workers' councils, the army is pushed out, and basically you have communism in Paris for a couple months before hundreds of thousands are killed. What does Courbet do as a famous artist in that time? He organizes a committee of artists to destroy monuments of empire. So the most famous is the Vendôme column in Paris. He toppled it, or he organized it to be toppled by artists. Did he consider that to be a work of art? I don't know, but I think in the history of art, it's a worthy entry. After the commune was squashed, he spent the rest of his life in exile for that. Second example might be Tatlin, his monument to the Third International, Russia in 1919. Just after the October Revolution in 1917, you have the birth of communist Russia. Tatlin gets put in charge of building a new monument to the new communist state. What does he do? He says, I'm going to build the first monument without a beard, he says, which is a phrase I absolutely adore. And what he comes up with is a huge abstract spiral that would be taller than the Eiffel Tower. And it would not only be an abstract monument, which was, in his view, the first one in history, but it would be a useful monument. It would house offices for the communist administration, for workers' clubs, and at the very top, a radio station. To disseminate, good working class propaganda. So that's where I would start my history of public art, with the destruction of monuments, and with I should say, Tatlin's monument was never built because there was a lack of public funds. So that's something that I think a lot of public artists can relate to as well, lack of funding. So it's a utopian dream that never got built, and that's partially why it persists in our imagination. That's where I'd start the history. And I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful co-panelists. I'm so grateful to be chatting with.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that. And I'm not a doctor, but I do agree. I mean, absolutely. I believe that, art and public art is like something that is very important. I'm glad that you mentioned all these monuments because as a sculpture major, it was something that, when I was going to AU Arts during the Black Lives Matter protest, it was, monuments that were the main center stage of public art, and all of the toppling of Confederate generals in the U.S. and whatnot. And so yeah, I totally believe that it is also a visual dialogue for communities to be able to have this conversation, and it also breaks language barriers, because as a visual medium, I mean, unless you do like letterings and whatnot. But yeah, I think it's definitely a big part of that. Cool.
Totally. And I think too is thinking about like the access of like who can be in public art. And I love that you mentioned like that it could be like a revolutionary like act to put up a monument or dismantle one, and that goes for like any type of public art. And I'm from Treaty 8 territory, Fort McMurray, and my family's from Fort Chipewyan. So we're heavily impacted by the oil fields, and it's something that I've been talking about in my practice pretty much ever since the Fort McMurray fire in 2016, called the Beast, swept through the town and destroyed a lot of parts of the city, specifically reserves, and a lot of where my family have lived for immemorial. So I think about that access of who can be part of public arts, and even the smaller ways, maybe not monuments, but what you just said, that mention of like resistance, like that fuel to come up against something as an act, as a protest. It just reminds me being back home in Fort McMurray 2 summers ago, and we're out driving around the res, my sister, my partner, and I, near Fort McKay. And so Fort McKay is a reserve that's really, really close to the oil sands, specifically Syncrude and Suncor, the 2 largest ones. So here's Syncrude and Suncor and all of the oil sands, and here is Fort McKay, the reserve, and it's actually downstream from the oil sands, right? So the youth population up there are heavily impacted by what's going on, obviously. There's a lot of cancer in the water that they say. So I love seeing these small points of resistance. You wouldn't expect it. You're just driving down the res roads, and you could see someone spray painting over small bridges and cutting down trees and using the trees to create these smaller sculptures. And one, it said like, the water is killing us, like you're killing us. And yet you can see like the smokestacks of like site in the background. I didn't get a picture, I really wish I did, but I'm just thinking about those smaller acts of resistance, those like anonymous acts of resistance. It can be really powerful. Are they witnessed all the time? Maybe not, but it felt such like a blessing to see it. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. So I just want to couple what each of you have said and kind of challenge that, because, you know, there is, like you're saying, guerrilla art, public art displays of like resistance that come up in specific communities. But the one thing that we know with large scale art, public art projects, is that there's always some kind of element of censorship, especially with the funding body that is overseeing the project, whether it's a municipality, you know, a sponsor, which I'm very familiar with, as well as arts organizations. So my question to you is, given those restrictions for larger projects, can public art challenge and change perceptions and invoke meaningful discourse around controversial issues?
Sure, I can jump in again. I think that's such a good point because, again, last summer, like exhibiting in Fort McMurray, the curator, Jess Kosher, it was through the municipality of Wood Buffalo. Sorry, it's such like a salad word. And it was like in the city hall where the exhibition was, and I love this curator. I think she does such great work. She's since resigned and is very public against Wood Buffalo, being like, hey, you're actually like really racist. And she has no problem like saying that like out loud to like a huge municipality. And there was a point where like a lot of my work in the past, especially when I was younger, where I was like featured like in my trans mask body, Indigenous body, often naked or nude, depending on the context. And there was a conversation point where we had to decide like maybe not, like don't even think about going there. Like your trans body cannot be represented in this space. Your Indigenous body, only certain parts can be that might be accepted for my personal safety and also like my community too that would be coming in to see it, and my grandma and my mom, right? So it's just thinking about that kind of stuff as well. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dan, that's a powerful example too, and sort of what I was saying of the history of monuments being a history, you know, of self-representation by the powerful, what kind of bodies are seen to encapsulate the highest values of a given society, right? And those have typically been, you know, militaristic, masculinist, you know, hard bodies, armored bodies, you know, literally militarized type of bodies, right? And so having public art that challenges those sorts of self-representations is probably one of the most important things I think public art can do. But on the other hand, you know, as Dan is saying, you know, from a personal place, that can actually put artists in danger sometimes, right? And as Eman's question pointed out too, that it can put a kind of a target on already marginalized bodies. So that's a problem. I don't obviously pretend to have anything like a solution, but it seems like one of the more pressing issues for public art today, especially in the city of Calgary, which has had its own recent histories of suppressing trans bodies in public art as well.
I mean, yeah, I think with public art too, it's the permission, right? And this sort of like asking for permission to be able to showcase things is something that is challenging. And, you know, with living in like a hostile environment where, you know, sometimes it's kind of a way to challenge those things. But at the same time, it's like, as you said, like the consequences of these actions can sometimes be life endangerment, and, you know, but I think at the same time, it's kind of a push, because whether we do this or not, you know, nothing's going to change if we're not pushing those boundaries, right? And yeah.
Okay. Are you okay? Okay, you're okay. No. Okay, I definitely agree with that. I think that, you know, a case that I like to always refer to, especially with our own personal experience, is that, you know, in 2020, there was an artist who petitioned the city of Calgary to have a Black Lives Matter mural here in the city, and the city was on board with it, which was awesome. And so a member of my collective, so one of our co-founders, was selected to create the mural. And even though the city was on board, there was a lot of bureaucratic back and forth, especially towards a beloved mural that's in the city, and so we had to change locations, and it actually turned out, even though it had the best intentions of the city to really push the boundary and to have something that the city could, reflect on and, essentially, become more progressive in some respects, it actually became incredibly traumatic, especially for this artist, and so and for a community too. So that experience always refers to me that you may have institutions that, they may have elements of censorship, but when it comes to public opinion, it could really change the course of what that project becomes and the meaning behind that project. So with that being said, and Harvey did mention hostile environments. So for artists who are looking to push the boundaries when it comes to public art, and especially around, sensitive, controversial issues, how does an artist navigate the balance between artistic expression and creating art in a hostile environment?
I just wanted to follow up that story that you mentioned with one of the muralists in 2020. I mean, I'm sure this happens a lot in the South, but that was the only mural I've known that had needed a 24-hour security and like a full fencing, and that quite literally being harassed every day just because you're painting a picture, an image, and that was welcome to Calgary. But yeah, I mean, with mentioning a lot of artists have to really adapt and to kind of shoehorn sometimes their projects and their and symbolism kind of sometimes help with that. But with that, accessibility becomes gets hindered because sometimes the symbols are only known to some, while others don't know it, or just artists are forced to become anonymous and to not. I mean, there's a lot of famous anonymous artists, but it's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, I think the balance can be often really hard to strike, and I also think about how, going off that, how an artist can take care of themselves throughout that process, because I can really only speak from my experience and thinking about other trans artists or Indigenous artists who've done public work. I tried to do a solo show at ACAD in the M&G, and it's large windows, and I had the large charcoal drawing of myself, and I was nude, I was completely naked, 2 months post top surgery and pre-T, so I had lovely, beautiful hips, and I thought I looked amazing, this large 6-foot drawing of myself, but it got censored and they tried to cancel it, and it was last minute, and people are always surprised. They're like, oh, AU Arts, why would they do that? And I'm it was only within the past 12 years, not a lot has changed, but I just think about how do you mitigate that? And I think what you just said, Harvey, about different symbols or different ways, but also that sometimes I get that pit in my stomach of okay, how much am I actually going to change to fit this narrative, this colonial racist society that's doesn't feel like I have a place in this society as someone like me. So I think about a lot of the art, yes, but also how do you take care of yourself as an artist? And what I've really had to rely on is who's around with me when art could be taken away all in 1 second, right? So that's what I've had to rely on. Who am I sharing this story with? And that's honestly the only way I could have gone through that experience, and countless others for sure. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. So I think in our experience, with artists, I like to talk to myself like I'm an artist. I am not. I help artists, but I'm definitely not one. The one thing that comes up quite a bit is that people bring a lot of personal experience to creating art, and especially creating public art, but we're also in a global sphere where people may be very passionate about an issue. So it could be, what's happening now in Palestine. You're seeing a lot of different groups, supporting, that cause. There is, with BLM, we're seeing that. And a lot of artists, whether they're part of those communities or not, want to do something, and they want to express themselves and really lead that social change within their own environment through their own art. And so my question is, for the artists on the panel, who come from two very distinct backgrounds, what role does public art play? If an artist is not from the communities that they're representing in their art, how can an artist ensure that their work is inclusive and representative?
I mean, I think the willingness to learn and adapt is something that is vital. And you know, I just recently did a 30 by 90 feet mural 2 weeks ago in the Northeast. And one of the things that we had to do was really, you know, I moved to Canada 11 years ago, but I grew up in the Northeast. But I've been living downtown for the past 8 years. And so even though, you know, there's this sort of like, oh, you're from here, you should know what it's about. Lots of things have happened in 8 years, right? And I feel like I'm still a visitor to this place that I grew up in because, you know, I haven't been living there. And I think that's something that artists should, you know, at least like have the willingness to adapt and then not come in with the sort of preconceived notion of what this community is and what it's about. And, you know, at the end of the day, the role of artist is to, you know, kind of make revolution irresistible somehow.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, but that's my thoughts.
That was really good. I'm sorry. I was like, what do I contribute after that? I mean, I just think about like the idea of like, I wouldn't want anyone to speak for me and vice versa, but like, how can you support people from different communities that need to have the platform to speak and share their own stories? I just think about working within like my own community. I wouldn't want to speak for my kuka, my granny, like I wouldn't want to speak for my auntie. So like, how would you support those people? Like, is this your story to share, or should you be uplifting those? Should you actually, I think about this a lot, should you pass this opportunity along to someone if it was offered to you, like that is more, not deserving, but I mean like could be more applicable to somebody else? Who can you take into the room with you that is not currently there? Like make that room, like make that space. And it's something I want to practice more myself. So I think about that for the future projects I'm involved with. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in relation to that question, I think immediately of this artwork, some of you probably have heard of from 2017, Sam Durant Scaffold. So he is a white American artist who was commissioned to do a big piece for the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. And I think he probably would describe his practice as being about political engagement, how art and revolution work together, about activism, opposition to settler colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. So all things we might want to hear. So his project for the Walker Art Center was he recreated, he called it Scaffold. He recreated the gallows where 32 Dakota men were hung in 1862. He rebuilt a scale model of it in the outdoor space of the Walker Art Center. As, if you asked him, a critique of American colonialism, of the violence of the American colonial project, as a way to remember the history of these executed Dakota men. But he didn't consult with the community. He came in as an outsider, had an idea of what he wanted to do and built it. And so it faced massive protest. So if you Google Sam Durant Scaffold, you'll see photos which I think were really powerful of the protests around the sculpture, saying basically people from the community saw it as, and who could blame them, whatever the intention of the artist, saw it as basically a monument to the murder of their ancestors, right? And so what happened? I'm hesitant to congratulate or condemn, so I'll leave it to you all to have your take. But what happened is that Sam Durant, the artist, had a meeting with Dakota elders from the community, and after one meeting decided that he would burn down the sculpture and never rebuild it and not take a cent for the commission. And then, has talked about the experience after that. Quite a lot he's talked about it as being a kind of transformative experience of realizing, wow, I came in with good intentions as an outsider, I came in with the idea that I was going to make a powerful political statement, and in fact ended up hurting the community that I wanted to speak for in a way. So anyways, that's an example that always comes to my mind as about this dynamic of representing or attempting to speak about, you know, the struggles, the traumas, the histories that one as an artist is not a part of. So, you know, it's a issue that is hard to resolve. It's maybe impossible to resolve because art is always about speaking to others across divides, you know. Anyway, but it's something, I don't know, maybe I'll throw it out to you all.
But that could have been avoided, right? If they like went and, you know, tried to take you know, and like in terms of having the conversation with the community, could have been easily avoided, but
Absolutely.
like
Never would have been built.
yeah, exactly.
So my next question to build on this, and this is specifically for the two artists, what are the ethical considerations an artist must take into account when creating public art that aims to address sensitive or traumatic events, whether it's historical events, current events? So what do you do to ensure that you are being true to your art, but also sensitive to the community that is perceiving and receiving your art?
Yeah, that's something I think about all the time. I think about it almost every day. It's such a good question, and thank you for that, because it's such an important one. And like the last thing I mentioned, like I wouldn't want to speak for anyone else, especially like my family members, because often my art has to do with me being Indigenous, me being placed in foster care. But with saying that, that's a lot of like family history and context, and that can go into like the public realm. And I honestly don't want to make art that would have another Indigenous person from the same nation or a different nation look at it and be like, oh my God, and like just shot through the heart. Like I really wouldn't want anyone to feel that way, despite me maybe getting a creative release or energy from it. So that's something that I've been reconciling for myself, because I feel like I was really pushed and talking to other marginalized people, alumni in art school, to really go for it and like really just get that trauma out and like wave it around. And I'm like, no, actually I really like don't like want to do that. And I've been in a lot of like situations or exhibitions that I'm privileged to be in that was like really emphasized. But what really changed for me was like reconnecting to like my family, my culture, my community, especially my grandmother, Jeanette Cardinal, who went through residential school, and my aunts and uncles who went through residential school in Fort Chipewyan, because it was only burned down by men in our community within the last 10 years, right? So these things are so fresh. So these considerations I think about all the time. And for other facets of my identity, I don't even know if that's the right word for being an artist, being a trans artist. I wouldn't want to, for the same ideas, I don't want to make other people, maybe not necessarily outside of my communities, like uncomfortable. I think it's fine to push public thought and opinion, but I wouldn't want to like have like a 10-year-old like trans kid see my art and be like, oh my God, I am re-traumatized. Like that's not really my goal. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, consent is definitely like a number one thing, right? And I mean, this is something that I had a conversation with earlier with a friend, and you know, when you make an artwork that is just like, you know, a private artwork in your studio, you know what I mean? It's you between the art, right? But when it goes to the public realm, it's not just you anymore. It's about the community and how that dialogue happens. And I think one of the things that I really considering is like, you know, having empathy and respect for these subjects that you're taking on is number one. And then, you know, of course, avoiding trivialization and tokenization is something that really needs to be, you know, avoided at all costs, because at the end of the day, you know, these are stories that directly impacts people's day-to-day lives. And yeah, I think that's, take on it.
Absolutely. Like, I think that's just having that perspective and like just being very cognizant of it really is very important, because I know artists' role is to really push boundaries, and especially when it comes to artistic expression, you want to make sure that you're being true to yourself as an artist. I'm talking like I'm an artist, but I'm definitely not. But I am God, no, please. But you know, you really do it. But just making sure that you're being very sensitive to the viewers or the people who are observing art is important. I know that, you know, just, I mean, in terms of like social media, like, you know, as seeing what's happening currently in Gaza, a lot of interpretive artwork has been created. And, you know, there's one that really stands out to me that I'll bring this example, but about a beheaded child, and somebody recreated that meme or that photo into an artistic meme. And like, yes, I know that it's very powerful to show like what is happening in the territory, but it's incredibly disturbing and incredibly hard to see like a human life being like trivialized like that. And I know the purpose of showcasing that and creating it into an art piece, but then, you know, for that family or for people who may have like these experiences in their own like communities, like incredibly hard. So yes, I'm glad that you guys, you two are taking those into perspective when creating art.
And my cynical thought is the purpose or the motivation behind, I don't know for sure, I assume behind this artist's work was to shock people into awareness, to show the horrors that are happening in Gaza that are being supported by our governments. But I think what sadly history, I think, has shown us is that there actually is no limit to the horrors that we can just sort of see and and become numb to. So this, you know, it's a very old artistic strategy of shocking viewers into political awareness. And I'm quite skeptical of the efficacy of these strategies, at least today, in a social media environment where we are just bombarded with you know, absolute horror and devastation, you know. How do you deal with it without repressing and without turning it into some sort of I don't know, yeah, this seeking to shock type of thing, right? Yeah. I don't have an answer.
That being said, how does social media help or hinder the impact of public art in a revolutionary movement? Because it could go both ways. It could, obviously, there's the, you know, mass communication piece, but then there's also, you know, who is, you know, taking in the art, how it's how it's being perceived. So I want to hear, like, I definitely have my opinion, which I will probably say after, but I would love to hear what the panelists think about the role of social media.
I think, I mean, it's two sides of the same coin, right? Like, one side is like, obviously it helps to amplify things and awareness, but awareness is not all of it. And at the end of the day, like, sometimes, you know, it dilutes the message because it just becomes a reel and it just becomes this tweet that like has no substance, and sometimes, you know, it helps, but sometimes it miscommunicate and misrepresents these things, you know.
Yeah, it's something, it's like such a hard thing to wrap my mind around too, like the pros and cons of it. And for me, it's sometimes what you just mentioned, Harvey, like it can get like trivialized. And then I think of like movements like Idle No More that wouldn't have happened without social media and like access to resources. So for me, it's like it's a pendulum that swings back and forth, but it's something that I think about a lot. So I'm not sure if I have the answers to it. And there's a lot I don't engage with, but I don't know. I'm not very active on social media either, so maybe I'm not the best one. Yeah, thanks.
I can't think of good examples, but you know, it's a medium like any medium, there for artists to use poorly and well. So I you know, blanket condemnation is probably not the best, and blanket affirmation either. So that's my non-answer.
It's a tool, right?
Yeah,
and it really depends on the person utilizing that tool. And at the end of the day, these social media companies also have their own agenda and their own biases. And at the end of the day, those terms and conditions, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hate it, but straight up. Full stop. I do think that with social media, like what I've seen just in terms of working in this space and being involved in 2020 in the Black Lives Matter mural controversy, it really did turn it into something that it wasn't. And I think since that experience, I think I would have had a different opinion of social media if I didn't go through it. I'd be like, it's a tool and we can, it's widespread and, it's good to communicate. But I think seeing how the meaning and the purpose and the intentions behind a project can be completely bastardized by the public, and to the point that it's actually not rooted in fact, and that is the narrative that people are running with, has really made me very incredibly skeptical of what I'm watching on social media, to the point that I cannot, if I see something that is highly controversial, especially when it comes to the artistic space, I really do shy away from it, or I try to dig in to see what's more of the story. So that is my hot take. So if anybody wants to jump in, you're more than welcome to. So with that being said, in terms of public art, so I'm going to change the course of conversation for just a second, but there is a lot of factors that can really stop artistic expression, whether it's an internal factor in terms of ensuring that you're being respectful of the story that you're looking to tell, or also external factors. Again, I work in sponsorship, so there is a lot of entities that really can dictate exactly what is put into the public sphere. So what strategies can be used to ensure that public art remains accessible and engaging to diverse populations, especially in underrepresented areas?
I mean, one example that I actually recently, I have a friend who is also a muralist, but one thing that that really shocked me the most was when he was telling me his story, and he applied for this mural project, but it's crazy because they told him that he couldn't afford to do this project because he doesn't have enough money in his bank account to start the project. Which to me, like, how does that make public art accessible when you need money to make money in terms of like setting up costs, right? And that to me was an example, I think, that like making it hard for artists to really get into the space, because now you're being asked, oh, why don't you have big boy money, And like, well, that's why I'm trying to get this job. Like, yeah, so I think it's a challenging sphere because, there's a lot of organization that flaunts accessibility and diversity, but when it's time to sign these contracts, those all go out of the way, Yeah.
I think too is just like working at like Stride Gallery and just like being a curator myself, and also being an artist who have been curated. I think about like the power of curating and how it can be like a form of accessibility, because there's a lot of artists that like won't apply, and that's just like one realm of like, that's like one layer of this like whole conversation. But like, is it accessible if you're not like going out and like reaching people and like talking to people and sharing the same air as them, or you just expecting them to come to you? And I think like a lot of the galleries, like especially in the past 20 years, that's the way it was. Like, I was a board member at Stride Gallery. There was no Indigenous people or Black people or people of color, trans people who applied to show at Stride in the past like 20 years before it took like a large overhaul. And I just think about that like all the time. So I think it's the idea of like going out to create that access, and just thinking about like, even from a perspective like that's not necessarily mine, because like we're on Treaty 7, I'm not from Treaty 7. Our people even who have lived here time immemorial, being consulted, being bringing in, being supported, being brought into these conversations, into these spaces as well. So I think about that a lot. I hope that might answer something. Yeah.
Yeah, and sort of building off what Harvey and Dan have said, we have a kind of an idea of public art where you have an artist who's a brilliant creative person who has a vision, an individual vision, and then they are hired to come and give something accessible and inspiring to a public. We don't know who that public really are. It could be almost anyone, right? But the goal of the public art, and whether it succeeds or fails, is this idea of, is it activating the public, right? Is it inspiring the public? Is it possibly inspiring visions of social change, or at least some sort of like inspiration, something like that? And that actually seems to me putting an incredible amount of burden on artists, a kind of unrealistic expectation on artists. Also underestimates and also washes out the public. Like it could be public becomes this like anonymous. Oh, that's not me. Good. That's my ringer. So I was thought immediately daycare calling or something. Anyway, and so could be when we take what's the word? Patronize the public, right? We think that they are this passive group that have to be activated and inspired by the unique genius of the artist, right? So if we're talking about accessibility of art, I think something has to happen that is out of the control of any artist or any one individual, which is broad-based, maybe flipping the script a little bit and starting from the bottom, arts funding for art education at a very young age in remote communities in the north, in underfunded schools. And so artists are not this like exterior force that come and give inspiration, but it's actually art is something that that anyone has access to. When you think of the amount of money it would take to give every child in Alberta access to art at a young age, it's not much money compared to the funds thrown around. But it's not a priority, right? In fact, that's the first thing to be cut, obviously. So anyway, I'll get off the pulpit.
So I have a question that, if there's a historical example, I would love to hear it. But for everybody in the panel, in what ways can collaborations between artists, activists, arts institution, government can enhance the effectiveness and reach of public art initiatives aimed at promoting change? So, and this can not just be political, this can also be environmental, which we're seeing now what's happening just in Alberta. And people becoming environmental refugees. So is there a world where this can exist? And if so, what are ways that we can collaborate?
I think it's totally possible, and I think it's been happening for a long time in different places, right? But I think combining expertise, no one's gonna save the world by themselves, and I think it comes down to, having diverse sets of expertise. And artists are always there to provide vision and other things, but at the same time, I believe that art itself in isolation will not change the world. Art, people who can change the world will change the world, but art could help move into that direction. And activists are they know what the community needs. And so combining that with art and also the government, government usually need more push than most. And so I think, of course, government could really provide support logistically and financially. So yeah, I think it's a must actually. It shouldn't just be done in isolation.
I think comes to mind a great 60s slogan, which is from the Situationist International in France. They said something like, we're not making revolution through art, we're making revolution in the name of art. That is to say, you make a revolution not by, like I said a minute ago, inspiring people with your great art, but you make a revolution in order to create a world where art can exist, freely, where people can become artists and afford to eat and live and things like that, right? So I like that, and that kind of thing agrees with Harvey. And if I had to think of, for me, the greatest work of Canadian public art of all time, I think I might choose a famous artwork that probably some of you have seen the relic of, Rebecca Belmore speaking to their mother. It's in the lobby. The physical object is in the lobby of the Banff Center. Last time I was there, of the conference center, sort of tucked away in a corner. I think most people don't know it's there who visit the Banff Center. And in part because the work, so what it looks like, this physical artifact, is a huge, huge megaphone, basically taller than I am. So and longer than I am too, a really huge megaphone. And Rebecca Belmore, what she did is after the so-called Oka crisis in 1990, she went around Canada to various Indigenous communities and made film too related to this, and used this huge megaphone to ask people to speak to the earth in whatever way that looked for them. And you can watch the film. Last time I checked, it's online. So this is an artwork it's a public artwork, but the thing itself is like kind of secondary, like the object. It's incredible. Like you should see it when you're in Banff if you haven't already. But the object is secondary. The work of art is the engagement. It's the conversations, the community relationships built, and it's also, quite literally giving a voice to people to speak their political concerns, their personal concerns, their spiritual concerns, et cetera, through a work of art. So Rebecca Belmore herself, as far as I'm aware, doesn't speak. Setting up a relationship with activists, with community members, and giving a kind of an ability to speak that hadn't been there before.
I love Rebecca Belmore's artwork so much. I'm so glad you mentioned her. I was so lucky to do a studio visit with her at ACAD, and I could not look at her in the eyes. I was so nervous. I was just like, don't look at me. She's amazing. And just thinking about that idea of she might not be the one speaking into the microphone. I haven't been lucky enough to see it or witness it. Is just that idea of visiting and supporting artists to create this art, to create that change. I think about the act of visiting all the time, and I've really noticed working at Stride and being an artist myself is that artists do need a lot of support. They need that conversation, that time. They need energy. They need you to look at them and see them. At least that's what I need. And I think it's that support, what you mentioned, Harvey, I think is really important. You can't do it alone in isolation. And it's something that I think a lot of people struggle with post-graduation, or if they don't have access to these creative spaces. I feel like Calgary needs more creative spaces, which is why I love the Alcove Center of the Arts that amazing team runs, that drop-in artist space. I think more spaces need to exist like that to get folks out of that isolated place. That doesn't work for everyone. Sometimes it works for some artists, but I find most of the time it really doesn't. But yeah, I think visiting for me is one of the most important things.
I think this is one, for me, the ideology, with a lot of political ideologies, I really do believe it's from the bottom up is the most effective way for it, for change. But in this case, I really do think it has to come from the top down. It's that the conversations that I have seen just being, working at Bump and, through FOREIGNERZ is that, a lot of voices, in order to adhere to the masses, there's a lot of voices that are silenced or censored. And from that, I don't think, there is a lot of, creative and incredible artists that are still, putting out controversial works that does have a strong message and voice. But I think when it comes to in your face, that pressure valve of public art that is really going to drive change, artists have to be given, carte blanche. They should be able to, really be able to express themselves in a way that artists should express themselves. And so that censorship, that top-down, stifling of that is what is really hindering, really public art being revolutionary. And I'm talking necessarily North America. Obviously, there's a lot of, Latin American examples, South American examples where, there has been a lot of change driven through public art. So I think until that is shifted, I think it's going to be an uphill battle. So yes.
Well, I think actually, if I think of value neutral, what's public art, the biggest examples, I picture the visual culture of Maoist China. That was a culture with a great public art. It was in service of a regime had a couple problems, but it was a public art saturated world, And I think too in the Cultural Revolution there was this culture of the putting up the big character poster, they were called, where you basically, it was a form of public denunciation of class enemies, right? So during the Cultural Revolution, there's this sort of, it's an amazing thing actually, because it's kind of a dark version of what we've been talking about so positively, a kind of a bottom-up mode of popular self-expression. It was a moment when everyone was encouraged to take up the paintbrush yourself, make a huge poster, and put it up on the wall to direct expression from the masses. And what it would be often a denunciation of your neighbor for being, insufficiently communist, in which case often would be the first step toward a purge, or somebody being shipped away to a work camp. So yes, that's public art. I'm value neutral on it. I don't. Saddam Hussein, totally public art. Yeah.
Personally, I've definitely dealt with a lot of that in terms of working with big companies that have this sort of, we'll hire you and then you're out, and there's sort of felt. But I think for me personally, what I can only speak for myself, of course, in my experiences, but something that I think I've learned a lot is, sometimes I apply for jobs and I apply for projects where I'm the only one supposed to be there, and then once I have my foot in the door, I'm like, come on in. And so I think that's something that could be done, and for me, I try to really have my community as a sort of my army behind me, and I think there's a way to do it, and you just have to be low-key about it. Don't tell people like I'm doing right now. It's a secret.
Yeah, I feel like it could be like really exhausting to jam your foot in there and like try to instigate that change. And I find that, like, I can't speak for Eva, but she's the co-director I work with, Eva Berhanu at Stride Gallery. I feel like we're both all the time advocating and like fighting for artists that have not been given opportunities, like in Calgary. And there's a lot of reasons why they haven't been given, and it's like racism and transphobia and classism and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, it can be really exhausting to advocate for like that respect for people like us to run an organization. So for me, like a strategy to keep doing that, I have to rely on her and vice versa so much, on all of my support network so much, because what I mentioned before, like if all of this went away, like who can I call? And like I've been privileged enough to be given access to talking to all of you folks and other opportunities, but some artists have not. So how can I advocate for those artists? And someone who's a caregiver for my sister with a disability, it's like I have to advocate for her every single day. And so it's just relying on folks when I literally cannot advocate anymore. I am tired today. So I think about that quite a bit.
I think, I think that even though I'm not a panelist, I'm the moderator, but I think the position that I, myself, Priya, and people who are part of FOREIGNERZ are in is that not only do we work in the public art space through an arts organization where we have to be very sensitive to, demands and, and what is produced, but within the FOREIGNERZ side, we really do try to push that boundary and like really try to challenge what people want, and because if you've worked in arts within Calgary, that can be a challenge. So I think like once you start, like it's like pushing an inch to get a mile, and I think that sometimes like revolutionary change doesn't happen on revolutionary terms. Like it sometimes it just takes people getting very used to an idea that will blow doors open. So I think that it is very important to really challenge institutions that you're working with, institutions that you're a part of, being a part of it to really like instigate that change. But then also sometimes you just have to like take matters into your own hand and either have a long-term game or a short-term game, which with FOREIGNERZ it's definitely a long-term game, but it's good game, so yes.
Coming from a low-income background, I think, and becoming a full-time artist, I think that's something that once you've kind of set up to do this and you've decided that there's no plan B, you just have to go full in, or and I think that the drive that keeps me going is, at the end of the day, I have my family have a my mother passed away when she was 30, my grandmother when she was 45, and so to me, mortality is a real thing, and all of us here will be gone probably, hopefully, not in 100 years or so, but I think that knowing that this finite moment in life that we're gonna have to do, and you do it or you don't, it's the way it is, Yeah. This is when having a great foundation starting off really helps. You know what I mean? When you're starting off and not having a sort of like, where do you draw the line? And I think that's if you have that in the beginning of your practice, then like once you continue and get into these spaces where, sometimes they want to push that boundaries, right? I think that's when it really helps. And I don't know, I mean, for me, I've been censored a lot, even by, I did this painting for the consulate of the Philippines, where they literally said hell no to all of them. But then they wanted us to, promote Philippines as this art-loving place, but it's not. And so that's when they're trying to tokenize us as artists, right? And trying to be like, we want to support you. And then they want us to pay them to do all of this stuff. Anyways, that's a long-winded question, but I think it's having that solid foundation and kind of continuing with that and not having to break those boundaries it's easier said than done, because once money talks,
All right, I would like to please round of applause for Trevor, Harvey, and Dan. Appreciate it. And I must do this as the community outreach manager at BUMP. Please come to our events. We have our Hyde Park party on Saturday. We would love to see you all. Next week we have 2 other events. Again, please support BUMP if you would like. Come talk to me if you want to talk sponsorship or if you know anyone. I have to do this, I'm sorry. It's my role. My boss is here, so I have to say it. So yes, but thank you so much for coming to talk about this very important conversation. I will definitely be down, so if you have any other questions, please let us know. Yes, and thank you for coming out to our Urban Art Conference. So appreciate it.